Hello, and thank you for joining us. I'm Kevin Fox. I'm the Center Administrator for the Albert LePage Center for History and the Public Interest. This is Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape, featuring Amy Jane Cohen. Um, this is our last event of the year. It's been really packed. I'd like to thank Falvey Library, Falvey DEI Committee, Africana Studies, Department of Political Science, and Department of History for co-sponsoring this event. I'm going to introduce Dr. Owolabi. He's going to introduce Ms. Cohen and she's going to tell us about her research. Dr. Olukunle Owolabi is Associate Professor in the Department of Political Science as well as the Director of Africana Studies at Villanova University. He received his honors BA with high distinction from the University of Toronto in 2001, his Master of Philosophy in Latin American Studies with distinction from Oxford in June 2003, and his PhD in Political Science from the University of Notre Dame in May 2012. He teaches courses such as Constructs of Blackness and African Politics, and has been a great friend and collaborator with the LePage Center and the History Department through his work in poli-sci and Africana Studies, and puts on terrific programming across campus with Africana Studies, such as hosting Dr. Hezekiah Lewis's social justice documentary class, students film screening, coming up next week, May 2nd at 6:30 in Topper Theater. Dr. Owolabi.
Thank you very much, Kevin. I would like to welcome everyone here this afternoon. Pleased to introduce and welcome to Villanova Amy Cohen, who is here to talk to us about her recently published book that came out, I think, 2 months ago, and has been garnering all kinds of positive attention and accolades in a politically fraught moment. The book is called Black History in the Philadelphia Landscape. And Amy Cohen is a former middle school and high school social studies teacher. And she also worked as director of education for a film company that sponsors educational content on documentaries, mostly on the history of Philadelphia. So she grew up in the city and is incredibly knowledgeable about its history and landscape. And I'm very pleased to welcome Amy Cohen to Villanova to share with us some insights and highlights and maybe lowlights as well from her new book on Black history in the Philadelphia landscape. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Kevin, and thank you, Dr. Owolabi, and thank you all for being here. Can everyone hear me all right? So I always like to start by talking about the elephant in the room. What is a middle-aged Jewish woman like me doing writing a book like this? And to answer that question, I have to go back about 20 years. As Dr. Owolabi said, I was a middle and high school social studies teacher. I had taught briefly a history of Philadelphia elective course. Hi, welcome, come in. And in 2005, the School District of Philadelphia passed a mandate requiring a year of African American history for every high school student. And at that point, no one in my social studies department had ever taught a Black history course. There were no Black teachers in the department, which was pretty typical across the city as well as across the country. And because I had taught a history of Philadelphia course, I knew a little bit about Black history in Philadelphia, so I volunteered to teach the course. And right from the beginning, I always had a focus on local history. And it went on to be the steepest and most meaningful learning curve of my life. But I left the classroom in 2013 and went to work for a documentary film company where we made documentaries about the history of Philadelphia, but not kind of the Ben Franklin Liberty Bell history, more of the less represented history. So I continued to learn a lot about local Black history. And then I started writing for an online publication called Hidden City that's about the built environment of Philadelphia. For a while, I was a monthly writer for them, and many of my articles were about local Black history. So what I found after all this time of teaching about, making films about, writing about, continuing to learn about Black history is that there was a real hunger for the information among my students and colleagues, and even the students' parents, among our film audiences, and among Hidden City readers. So I started to think that it might be a good thing to turn what I had learned into a book, particularly because I knew that there wasn't an accessible overview of Philadelphia Black history that was really aimed at the general public rather than an academic audience. And what got me over the hump and pushed me to go ahead and write a book proposal for Temple University Press were the wise words of Toni Morrison: if there is a book that you want to read and hasn't been written yet, then you must write it. And just to explain why I wanted to focus on the landscape, it also goes back to when I was teaching, because things in the landscape are a really good way to connect past and present. So when my students, for example, in a Black history class, when you come across Thomas Jefferson, you don't just learn about Monticello and the Declaration of Independence, you also learn that he was an enslaver on a major scale, that in Notes on the State of Virginia, he said derogatory things about Black people as a race, while he was also having children with Sally Hemings. So I'd put up a picture of the Jefferson Memorial and say, do we see it any differently now? And should there be some kind of signposting? And put that out there to the kids. And for students, the answer would range from, no, don't change it, it's an American icon, to push the whole thing in the Potomac. And I do want to start by taking a broader view, looking at the national scene. So which individual historic figures are most frequently represented in American monuments? What specific names of people can you think of who are most often kind of in bronze on top of a granite block across the country? Any ideas? Lincoln?
Jefferson too, I would imagine.
Okay. Well, I'm going to give you the top 6. Number 6 is Robert E. Lee, which, think about that for just a minute. Like, in any other country, would a figure in his position still all these years later be in that elevated a position? Number 5, I thought maybe at a Catholic university someone would finally guess this, but no one ever does, St. Francis of Assisi. Martin Luther King is number 4. Christopher Columbus is number 3. He's controversial in his own right, but we're not getting into that today. And then, as you all guessed, number 2, George Washington. This is the fountain in Aikens Oval across from the Art Museum, a place that I have driven or walked or rode by thousands, if not tens of thousands of times in my life. And it wasn't until I was putting this presentation together that I realized that the guy on the horse is George Washington. But I forgive myself, and I forgive you as well if you didn't know that, A, because it is a very, very busy fountain, and B, we're very accustomed to seeing white guys on horseback. And then also, as you guessed, number 1 across the country is Abraham Lincoln. In Philadelphia, we have a Lincoln statue on Kelly Drive that was erected in 1871, making it one of the earliest in the country. The day it was dedicated, 50,000 people showed up. Okay. Again, putting questions out to you. hold up your fingers, and that's a hint right there. You know it's less than 10. Of the 50 most represented figures, how many are people of color? You already know there's Martin Luther King, so it has to be one or more. I see. All right. What number do you have?
4.
4. Okay, we had 3 right answers here, and Kevin. The answer is 4. 4 people of color in the top 50. How many are female? I see a 1. I see a 2. Kevin again. Excellent. Did you already look through this? I did email it to him. There wasn't a prize for getting the right answer, but I am really impressed. Okay, so there's 3 females, but just to illustrate the dearth of females, there are 11 times as many statues of mermaids across the country as there are of female congresswomen. And then a more serious question, of the top 50, how many were enslavers? You don't have enough digits, fingers, and toes included. The top 50, fully half were enslavers, which is, again, something that should give us pause in the year 2024. And how do I know all this? It's because an organization called Monument Lab, that's Philadelphia-based but has become nationally and even internationally recognized, did a huge survey a few years ago, and these are the results they came up with that were published in 2021. So just to answer who the people of color and women are other than Dr. King, Joan of Arc is number 18, Tecumseh is 24, Sacagawea 25, Harriet Tubman 28, and Frederick Douglass 29. So after they did this really massive, very well-funded study, and if you're curious, you can look online on Monument Lab. I mean, there's all kinds of fun statistics. They came up with 4 conclusions. One is that monuments have always changed, which is important to think about because it can be very controversial when we try to change the monument landscape. The second is that the monument landscape is overwhelmingly white and male. The most common features of American monuments reflect war and conquest. And finally, the story of the United States, as told by our current monuments, misrepresents our history. Or, as New York Magazine said, the nation's monuments are male, pale, and stale, summing up the whole report. Okay, so that's the national picture. Let's take a quick look at Philadelphia. This monument between Logan Circle and the Franklin Institute is the All Wars Memorial to Colored Soldiers and Sailors. It was erected in the early 1930s after a 5-year battle about its placement. The Black state representative, whose idea was to have such a memorial honoring 150 years of military service by Black men, had wanted it on the Parkway. The all-white art jury said no, and there was a long standoff. Eventually, a compromise was reached, and it was installed in Fairmount Park, where it sat for 60 years, and finally, in the 1990s, it was moved to where it had always been envisioned. And then in September 2017, this statue of Octavius Catto, a 19th century scholar, educator, Civil War recruiter, civil rights activist, and voting rights proponent, Octavius Catto, was unveiled at City Hall. And when that happened, he became the first African American represented as an individual on public land in a statue like this, which is really pretty incredible that it took that long to get that level of recognition. But the statue is actually part of a much bigger memorial. It's in a very prominent place on City Hall. A Harriet Tubman statue on the City Hall apron is supposed to be following at some point soon. And these are some photos I took that really show that there is an immediate impact of seeing representation in a statue. Okay, so those are really the two major statues of African Americans in Philadelphia on public land. I mean, there's some athletes down at the stadiums, but I'm looking at public land. So how did I write a whole book about just two statues? Well, I didn't, because I broadened the definition. So other than traditional monuments, how do we represent historic people, events, and institutions in the landscape?
Historical markers.
Yes.
Well, in Philadelphia, there are all these murals.
Yes. Okay, so that's a good start. So historical markers are things that I write about a lot and have thought about a lot for a long time, partly because back when I was teaching that History of Philadelphia course in 2004, students of mine applied for a marker to commemorate an anti-Black riot that took place in 1842 along Lombard Street, and their proposal was accepted by the State Historical and Museum Commission, which taught me that we as individuals, as citizens, as community members, that we can have a role in influencing what kind of history we're telling ourselves and visitors. This is a marker about the Pennsylvania slave trade that sits on Delaware Avenue. And the gentleman right here, Charles Blockson, who passed away last April, was a renowned collector of books, manuscripts, sheet music, artifacts, recordings, all kinds of materials about Black history. And he realized that in the early 1990s that there were only 2 historical markers in the entire city that were relevant to Black history. So he got some grant money, used his collection, and applied for dozens of markers. And so if you see markers about Black individuals, events, or institutions around Philadelphia, a lot of them say 1991 or 1992. And at this point, about a third of our markers in the city are about Black history. Another reason that I wanted to show this marker is because Blockson, in spite of being responsible for so many of the city's Black history markers, said that this one, when it was unveiled in 2016, was the one he was most proud of. I also like to share this one because it chronologically shows where my book begins. Chronologically, it begins in the 1600s, because there have been Black people in what's now Philadelphia since then. And then you said murals, lots and lots of murals around the city, many of them about historical figures. This is about Father Paul Washington, who was the pastor at the Church of the Advocate. You can see there in the upper right corner. And he made that church what we would now call a safe space for Black Power activists. And I wanted to choose this of all the many murals that there are, because this gives the bookend. The book chronologically stops with the Black Power movement in terms of the history, in terms of how we're showing it in the landscape, it goes right up to the present day. Public spaces like parks. This is Julian Abel Park near what was the Christian Street home of the Black architect, Julian Abel. And names of schools. So this is a school in South Philadelphia, a very diverse school on 12th Street. And the school community decided a few years ago that they didn't really want to be the Andrew Jackson School anymore, because Andrew Jackson, as a president, not only was he an enslaver, but he was responsible for really mass murder of Native Americans. And so they undertook a community engagement project and came up with the name of Fanny Jackson Coppin, who was an educator along with Octavius Catto at the Institute for Colored Youth. Street names is another way we represent figures. This is on Allen's Lane in Philadelphia, where I live in the Mount Airy section of Philadelphia. Allen's Lane is named after William Allen, who I think he was in Supreme Court early on, but he was also an enslaver like so many early figures in our past. But Richard Allen is the founder of the AME denomination and Mother Bethel AME Church. And so this street, as well as the SEPTA train station beside it, have been renamed for him. It's pretty easy to get the little red honorary markers, and I'm seeing them more and more. Of course, I asked Philadelphia Streets Department if they could give me a list of honorary street names, because I thought it'd be interesting for the purpose of the book to see how many of them were for Black figures, but almost needless to say, they don't keep a list. They just kind of say yes and make them, and that's it. What's much more complicated is to change an entire street, as was done when Columbia Avenue was renamed for civil rights leader Cecil B. Moore, because that involves the post office, it involves the DMV, because everyone who lives on that street and every business on that street, their address officially changes, so you don't see that quite as much. And historic sites is another way that we, in the landscape, remember our past, and this is the Marian Anderson House in South Philadelphia. And Monument Lab that I referenced earlier, they define a monument as a statement of power and presence in public. And that was the definition I used for the book. So monuments can be statues of historic figures cast in bronze and put atop granite, but they can also be much smaller, and those are the kinds of things that I examine in the book's chapters. Just to let you know how the book is set up, it's 19 really case studies chronologically. So each chapter tells a story of Philadelphia Black history and then looks at how it's represented in the landscape. If you don't have a background in local Black history, it will give you a good overview. If you're already pretty familiar with the content, it will give you a different lens to look at that history through. Okay, so the way that the landscape changes, what I found as I was learning the history and then writing the book, is it's really important to understand, and I'm sure most of you know this, or all of you know this, this is what I would start with the first day in my high school history classes, is to ask students what history is, and usually the answer would be the past. It's everything that ever happened. No, that's not true. It's an ongoing process of interpreting the past. Another way of saying really the same thing is that the past does not change, but our understanding of it does. Historical interpretations often reveal more about the times in which they are written than they do about past events. And then, most importantly, for our purposes today, as our historical interpretations evolve, our monuments reflect new understanding. And even though those are my words in my book, I kind of wish that I had qualified that more, because it makes it sound like it's an automatic process, and it's very far from that. It takes time, it takes organization, it takes community will, it takes political will, and it takes money. So it doesn't happen automatically, but at least in Philadelphia, the place that I know the best, certainly in this century, the landscape has changed dramatically. And the best example of that is the President's House Memorial at 6th and Market on Independence Mall. How many people are familiar with that? Most of you. Okay. I want to do a reading from my book, and I thought my book was here, and it's not. So, well, those are extra copies. I mean, if I can't find my copy, I'll use that. So here is my dog-eared copy. And I'm not going to read an entire chapter, just parts of a chapter. And this chapter is about the President's House. And as you may well know, Philadelphia was the national capital from 1790 to 1800. And during those years, the presidents, Washington and then Adams, lived in this house that was called the President's House at 6th and Market. At that point, Market Street was called High Street. And that's where I am going to pick up the reading. When Washington left office in 1797, John Adams became the next resident of the President's House. Adams and his son John Quincy Adams were the only two of the first 12 U.S. presidents who did not own enslaved people. Although the national capital was supposed to move to the banks of the Potomac, leaders in Pennsylvania tried mightily to keep the capital in Philadelphia. A mansion 3 times the size of the President's House was constructed on 9th Street as a luxurious abode for the nation's chief executive. Adams, however, could not be enticed to decamp to this grand residence, even when the city doubled the rent on the President's House to force the move. In December 1800, Adams became the first president to inhabit the White House in Washington, D.C. The Philadelphia President's House was sold and initially became a hotel. As the surrounding area became increasingly commercial, the once elegant dwelling was gutted and converted into 3 stores on the ground level with a boarding house on the floors above. Although the facade of the building was significantly altered, some of the original walls were still in place. And this is a photo of 6th and Market from 1949. The walls on that Washington Hall clothing store, some of those were original to the President's House. But in 1951, the entire structure, along with hundreds of other longstanding buildings, was demolished to make room for Independence Mall. So just to orient you, that's Independence Hall up there, and then all those buildings north of Independence Mall were just raised to make the Independence Mall that we're now used to. A public restroom was built on the President's House site. A small plaque indicated that the toilet facility sat atop the former home of presidents. In late 2000, an archaeological dig on Independence Mall revealed that a proposed new home for the Liberty Bell, a symbol long associated with freedom overlapped some of the outbuildings of the president's house. By January 2002, construction of the Liberty Bell Center was well underway when a bombshell revelation about the location of the new structure came out in the winter issue of the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography. An article by the independent historian Edward Lawler meticulously presented information about the architecture and appearance of the president's house. Among his findings, quote, "The last thing that a visitor will walk across or pass before entering the Liberty Bell Center will be the slave quarters that George Washington ordered added to the president's house." So this was the entrance. Right here is where those slave quarters were located. So when that article is published, historians are outraged and some journalists pick up the story, so community members are upset. And initially in 2002, the representatives of Independence National Historical Park said, well, we already have all the placards written for inside of the Liberty Bell Pavilion. They've all been improved, and we're just going to leave things as they are. The outrage continued, so eventually a compromise was reached, and that's where I'm going to pick up the reading. Once agreement between historians and the Independence National Historical Park leaders was reached regarding the Liberty Bell Center, attention turned to the President's House site. Grassroots activism by Black Philadelphians was central to this next phase. On July 3, 2002, hundreds of African Americans gathered at the Liberty Bell Center to demand a monument to Washington's slaves. The Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, or ATAC, led by the attorney Michael Cord, organized a petition drive and a letter-writing campaign with this same objective. Chaka Fattah, a Black member of the U.S. Congress, spearheaded legislation to appropriate funds for the National Park Service to develop a plan to commemorate the President's house and its enslaved residents. And then there's a couple paragraphs about deciding on the design of the house, and then finally, on a bitter cold December morning in 2010, the President's House, Freedom and Slavery and the Making of a New Nation, was dedicated. Emmanuel Kelly's innovative open-air monument broadly represents the structure and dimensions of the President's House. Historical reenactments are displayed on video monitors perched on brick walls above faux fireplaces. A granite wall lists the name of each person enslaved at the President's house. Critics panned the new monument's form and content. Inga Saffron, who I just learned is on the advisory board of the LePage Center, and she's a friend, but this is what she had to say for the Philadelphia Inquirer, called it a confused jumble of bricks. Edward Rothstein of the New York Times described it as lacking both intellectual coherence and emotional power. In the Pennsylvania Magazine of History and Biography, Stephen Kahn wrote of the video monitors mounted on chimney walls, rather than evoke one of the grandest houses in 18th century Philadelphia, these make the place feel more like 21st century McMansions. And then there's some more bad reviews, but then here's where I'll finish my reading. The President's House monument neatly fits the description of at least one constituency involved in the memorial's planning. The Avenging the Ancestors Coalition sought a design that was a, quote, culturally dignified, historically complete, prominently conspicuous, physically dramatic, formally official, and timely installed commemoration on the grounds of the President's House to honor primarily the 9 enslaved African descendants. Though some would argue that historically complete is too high a bar, the President's House, Freedom and Slavery in the Making of a New Nation, otherwise fulfills ATAC's criteria beautifully. Love it or hate it, the President's House Memorial is a manifestation of a sea change in how Black history is represented in Philadelphia. In 2002, leaders of the Independence National Historical Park sought to maintain the fiction of heroic founding fathers, creating a glorious nation characterized by liberty and justice for all. They eschewed input from academics and the general public. Over the course of less than a decade, however, the orientation of the Park Service changed dramatically. The history presented to locals and tourists at the President's House Memorial and elsewhere has become significantly more challenging, more complex, and more inclusive. Adjacent to the Liberty Bell Center, where officials once resisted including information about slavery, sits an entire structure whose purpose is to make visitors contemplate the people whose bondage helped to build our country. And then what follows in that particular chapter is a reflection by the leader of the Avenging the Ancestors Coalition, Michael Cord. About half the chapters have reflections of people who were either involved in memorializing the history or in the later chapters, people involved in the history itself. And then all of the chapters have a to-do list at the end of ways that you can continue to learn about the subject matter, whether through site visits or widely available videos or primary sources on websites and so forth. So in wrapping up, what I hope the one big takeaway is in my book is that these things matter. Like, no, a monument, a mural, a street name, a marker, none of that is going to correct the injustices of the past. None of that is going to ensure a more equitable future. But what I heard again and again and again as I spoke to people while writing the book is that these things matter. And no one can say it better than the young poet Amanda Gorman, who read her poem, The Hill We Climb, at President Biden's inauguration. In that poem, she says, being American is more than a pride we inherit. It's the past we step into and how we repair it. So on that note, I really want to thank you for your attention. If you know folks who might be interested in hearing me speak, I list events on my website. If you know other groups who might want to hear me talk, you can reach me through my website or at my Gmail. And with that, I really want to thank you and see if there are any comments or questions. So thanks a lot.
Thank you so much for writing the book and sharing it with us. I would like to open up the floor to Q&A. And I know there are lots of people in the audience who have been waiting to weigh in with thoughts, questions, comments, feedback, etc. So I'm going to start over here. If you can maybe share with us who you are, just so we all know each other, that would be great. I'm going to start with Yuta over here.
Hi, thank you for the presentation. My name is Jutta Seibert. I used to be the history librarian here at Falvey. I wanted to hear your take on the murals in Philadelphia. I have a very conflicted view, and it goes a while back. I used to have a friend who lived in South Philadelphia in a predominantly Black neighborhood. And at that time when she lived there, they started putting up all those murals, and she was very annoyed with it and said, you know, you see it, right? It's the Black neighborhoods get the murals, the white neighborhoods get them, the fountains, the parks, the monuments. And even today, whenever I see a mural in Philadelphia, I say, oh yeah, that's a poor neighborhood. That's the first thought. So I can't really unsee what I've seen then. And I wonder if there's a connection to graffiti, and that graffiti for me can be very political, aggressively political. It doesn't have to be. Whereas murals feel a little bit like appeasement.
Yeah, that's a really interesting question. And I don't know if you know that when the mural arts program started, it was originally called the Anti-Graffiti Network. And the idea was that they enrolled graffiti writers. I mean, people like me who lived in Philly in the 70s and early 80s might remember Cornbread, whose name was everywhere. I think he even graffitied an elephant at the Philadelphia Zoo. He was, yes. He was involved in the anti-graffiti network, which eventually became mural art. So I have heard that comment about the kind of the stigma of a mural. Your neighborhood must be poor if it has murals, but they are also often really beautiful. The process is very thoughtful in terms of there's always community engagement involved in designing the murals, and that's why there's rarely, not never, but rarely graffiti on the murals themselves. So I understand the issue. Yeah, there are more and more murals in Center City. I mean, I think a lot of it has to do with the availability of walls, and because Philadelphia has become known as a city of murals, I mean, I think initially that criticism was more on point, but now that it's become kind of a selling point for Philadelphia, and there's a lot of pride in our murals, I think that they are in more neighborhoods. The other issue with murals is of all these ways of commemorating things, they seem to me the most ephemeral. Like there's one of Martin Luther King when he did a big speech at 48th and Lancaster Avenue, and the last time I drove by there was a building going up right next to it. So they can very easily be covered. So I take the point, but I'd rather live in a city of murals than not. I'm not sure that the absence of murals would get fountains in the poor neighborhoods.
More questions? Yeah, Judy.
Thank you, Amy, for your talk. We have an alumnus from the history department, Leo Vicaro, who started a movement to rename Taney Street. I wondered what your thoughts were about it. We're not entirely clear whether or not that's after Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice, who was responsible for the Dred Scott case, but the timing indicates that it might be. And so Leo and a group of his neighbors have been working for some number of years to rename the street. And I wondered what you thought about it, or what you...
Yeah, that's funny. About half the time I have a slide in there about Taney Street, and half the time I don't. So Taney Street, what Philadelphians call Taney Street, was, we think, named for Roger Taney, the Supreme Court Justice who wrote the Dred Scott decision saying that no Black person, free or enslaved, could ever be a citizen of the United States. And a movement started in 2020 to rename the street. There was a community engagement process, and community members decided they wanted to name it for Caroline LeCount, who was Octavius Catto's fiance at the time he was assassinated, and an activist and educator in her own right. And they've been pressing for it for 4 years. Now, I already mentioned that it's much harder to change an entire street name than just to do a little red banner. But the problem with Taney Street, or Taney Street as I grew up calling it, is that it's in several different neighborhoods in the city. I was familiar with the block in the Fittler Square neighborhood next to Taney Playground, but there's also, it continues in like the Francisville area in North Philadelphia, it continues into Grays Ferry. I think it's in either 3 or 4 councilmanic districts. As much as there have been petitions signed by almost every resident on the street, there have been rallies. I mean, they've done everything right. And yet somehow the relevant council members have never quite been able to get on the same page at the same time to make it happen. So it's a footnote in my book because it hadn't yet happened, but I certainly assume by the time the book was published, it would have happened. I don't know. I mean, so it's one of those sort of inexplicable things, but just one of the frustrating things about how slowly sometimes the gears of government operate. Because I don't think that there's a pro-Roger Taney faction in Philadelphia.
More questions? Yeah, Kevin?
So, sort of relatedly, I was curious about what was your response when you learned that the city doesn't actually keep a record of the honorary like street sections, because that is perplexing to me.
Well, again, I mean, I don't like to just take jabs at the city, but I think the way it happens is if you have a city council person and they're willing to, you know, enter it as legislation and they have enough votes from their fellow council members, everyone agrees, and it's kind of a political favor done. It's pretty easily done. So with the Richard Allen name change, I know State Rep Chris Rabb was really the first person to come up with the idea, and then Reverend Mark Kelly Tyler, who's the pastor at Mother Bethel. They're both pretty important folks, and so they said to the city councilwoman, Cindy Bass, will you do this? And she did, but like she didn't even show up for the ceremony or anything. So I guess no one seems to have enough of a vested interest. It's kind of done as a kind of very easy political favor. You know, it's kind of the commemorating equivalent of filling a pothole, unfortunately, because it means a lot to the people where it happens. I showed that mural of Father Paul Washington when I had first started teaching my history, my African American history course. I read an article about this person I didn't even know who they were, named Father Paul Washington, and saw that some blocks of Diamond Street were being named after him. And for some reason that captured my interest. So I wrote to the Inquirer reporter. He gave me the contact information for Paul Washington's widow and Washington's son. They both came to my classroom and talked to the kids about what Father Paul had done and how much that meant to them. And then for me, it just, through them, I ended up meeting so many other leaders in the Black community from like the 60s and 70s era. So I know it was meaningful to them, but for, you know, whoever got it through, it was just, okay, you know.
So if someone was trying to make a list of all these, they would find it like legislative records, but there's
I guess someone could do it. I think if you went through, I think you're right. If you went through all the city council sessions whenever it started, I mean, I didn't dig any harder than talking to people at the streets department who I was in touch with at the time because I had applied for a historical marker and it was getting installed. And when that happens, you have to work with the streets department. So I kind of had the direct contacts of those folks. And, you know, that was what they told me. I think if I wanted to spend a lot of time in an archive, I could find it. It's a good point.
We have a question over here. David.
I am David Baird. I'm in the political science department. I know a movement's much bigger than any one person, but I was thinking about Martin Luther King Jr. and the fact he spoke here at the Villanova campus in the mid-'60s, and I thought, wow, maybe there's a plaque. I don't know, but if not, we need to do that. He went to divinity school, I think, in
Chester.
He must have spent real time in Philadelphia. Is he much noted in the Philadelphia area with, I don't know, plaques or sculptures or anything?
There is at 40th and Lancaster, where the mural has recently been obscured, there's a like a bust of Martin Luther King there because he spoke there. There's a plaque in Francisville that has something to do with the assassination. There's Martin Luther King Drive, which, you know, as I said, that's kind of a substantial change to make, although no one really lives along the drive. But he went to divinity school in Chester, and he was in Philadelphia quite a few times. He came to the Girard College protests. But I don't know of other major representation.
So I have a question. I'm curious about some of the things that you learned differently or maybe unlearned about this history of Philadelphia by studying it through like the lens of Black history. And I'm curious about this because like I first moved to this area 13 years ago when I started working at Villanova. And in fact, I'd never been to the Philadelphia area before. And so when you first move here from another part of the country, one of the things that's really apparent is how the city and the surrounding area kind of wears its late 18th century history on its sleeve. Like that's what is really kind of put forward as kind of the glory days. Mm-hmm. But I wonder what looks different when you study the history of the city and surrounding area through the lens of Black history. And maybe there were some other historical moments, because I know your book goes back to the 1630s, that are really highlighted when you're kind of looking at the Black history of the city.
I mean, I could give you a lot of examples, but the best and probably most on-point example is that we love to talk about, you know, we're the Quaker city, city of brotherly love, you know, seat of abolition, Lucretia Mott, and all that. In 1838, the vast majority of Philadelphians were either indifferent or pro-slavery, because you had a lot of low-skill Irish immigrants who didn't want an end to slavery because it would be job competition. And then you had more of a merchant class that had business ties as well as social ties with the South. So abolitionists were having such a hard time even finding a place to meet that they collected a whole lot of money and they built a meeting place called Pennsylvania Hall. And it was, you know, a beautiful building on a grand scale. 3 days after it opened, it was burned to the ground by a Philly mob. And that's kind of significant history to just not be taught and not be known. And, you know, as I said, I was born and raised in Philadelphia. I never heard of that incident until I was teaching the class. So that's probably the most on point example, but there are plenty more in the book. Like people, and it's no surprise because of how we market ourselves as a city, so many people are shocked to learn that there was slavery in Philadelphia.
Thank you. Who else would like to ask a question, share a comment, thought?
Thank you.
If we're good, can I say something about selling books?
Absolutely, you can say something about selling books. Yeah.
So, okay. So here's my pitch, which is that I'm selling books over there. If you buy them from me, they're $15 and I'll sign them for you. Whereas the list price is $18.95. And I thought there would be more students here for whom I often will say, and it's a great Mother's Day gift. It's also a great grad gift. So if you're interested, no pressure. But I will be selling and signing. And do you want to close up or?
So, yep, the idea behind the LePage Center is creating a more historically informed public. Thank you for contributing to our mission today, Amy. Thank you all for coming, and to Falvey for hosting us and contributing. Dr. Owolabi as well. Yeah, just thank you all for coming. Have a great rest of your day and good into the semester and hopefully rejuvenating something.